All right, I think we're going to get going. People kind of fill in as we go here, but we're going to go ahead and get started since you guys actually showed up at 8:30. First of all, congratulations. It's 8:30 MMS on a Thursday morning. Did everybody have a good time last night? Clearly not too good of a time because you're here this morning, which is, I appreciate that. That's very nice of you. My name's Josh Heller. I'm a senior product manager on the Windows team. And basically, we're here today to talk about dynamic access control, which is part of our overall identity and security strategy. So basically, I'm the product manager for all the identity and security assets. So think of things like Active Directory, what we're going to talk about today, like dynamic access control. What we're going to do is basically give you guys an introduction to dynamic access control. We have been talking about dynamic access control for, I don't know, a few months, and with certain partners, like 6 months to 8 months. And we can do like all-day sessions just on dynamic access control. So my goal here today is just to give you guys a flavor of what dynamic access control is all about, and give you sort of a jump start so that if you're interested in it, give you some places to go learn a little bit more about it, and then I'll also talk about some other opportunities as well. Yeah, so let's do it. All right, so quick agenda. It's pretty straightforward. What we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what is the challenge, what is this data management challenge that we've got. I'm not going to spend a ton of time there because this is the reality that you guys live every day. We're also going to talk a little bit about Windows 8 platform investments. Anybody that saw my session yesterday on direct access, I'm going to go ahead and, you've already heard this, but I'm going to make the same disclaimer again. We changed the name from Windows Server 8 Beta to Windows Server 2012 the other day. It's very, very exciting. We haven't had time to go through and sort of update it in all of our slides and everything. So if you hear me refer to Windows Server 8 or Windows Server 2012, I am referring to the exact same thing. It's just really early and my brain's not completely aligned to one thing or the other yet. So we're going to talk about some platform investments we've made within Windows itself, specifically around the file classification infrastructure, which some of you guys may be familiar with, and then also around Active Directory. It doesn't initially appear obvious, but we've actually made one of probably the most fundamental change to Active Directory architecture since we introduced it back in Windows 2000. We're going to talk a little bit about how we specifically have introduced this idea of dynamic access control on the Windows 2012 file server. And then we're going to spend a fair amount of time doing demos. A lot of the sessions you see here kind of jump in and out of demos, which is awesome. What we're going to do is actually, I don't want to say wait till the end because it's actually nowhere near the end, but we're going to get through some slides. I'm going to talk about dynamic access control, and then we're actually going to run through some scenarios that are going to introduce you guys to the different concepts of dynamic access control, because I think it actually helps. Dynamic access control is not a simple concept, and I think it helps make it a lot more tangible if you can actually see it. How many of you guys are at least sort of high level familiar with what dynamic access control is? Either read about it online, talked to me at the booth about it, something like that. It's like a handful of people. Okay, cool. That's normal. I don't expect many people to know about it. It's not often we introduce kind of like a net new feature to Windows Server, especially in Windows Server 2012. There's very few. Windows Server 2012 is kind of like the culmination of lots of other things. You know, it's Hyper-V 3, version 3. It's PowerShell version 3. So it's lots of stuff has sort of come to maturity. This is one of the few things we're introducing that's more or less net new. So first we're going to talk about, what is this challenge, right? So you guys as IT pros see this every single day. You're seeing exponential growth in the users and the data that they carry with them. You may be lucky enough to have some sort of structured data storage solution like SharePoint, but more than likely you guys have like a mess of file servers floating around. File servers are great. We're going to talk about why they're great in a minute, but the bottom line is you guys have lots of users, and those users have lots of data. Distributed computing. We have sort of left the era of little computers doing little things in the corner of a room. We kind of now have big servers running lots of data across the world in different data centers. And we have to come up with a way to sort of manage them en masse, because even though you guys may have seen a 10-time growth in the number of servers in your environment, my guess is you guys have not seen a 10-time growth in staff to manage those servers. So how do we mitigate that? Regulatory and business compliance. This is a little bit new, right? Over the past 5 to 10 years, we've seen a big uptick in not only being asked to adhere to corporate IT policy, but being asked to adhere to policies that affect the IT infrastructure that are being pushed down through industry regulations like payment card industry, through governmental regulations like in the US, you've got things like Sarbanes-Oxley. These are things we have to deal with, and typically those regulations don't take account for the challenge you guys have as IT administrators, because there's a cost to implementing those guidelines. You don't necessarily get a choice, but there's still a cost to doing it, and frequently your business is going to give you a whole lot of extra money to achieve that compliance. Which leads me right into this last point, which is budget constraints. You guys don't have unlimited budget. You're asked to do more with less. That's probably one of the themes you've seen here at MMS, is we're trying to help you guys do your job better with less money. How can we give you the tools as your partner at Microsoft so that you guys can do your job more efficiently at a lower cost to your business? We tend to frame this up in sort of through the viewpoint of the people that are faced with a challenge. You've got a CXO or some sort of IT director that's basically saying, you know what? At the end of the day, I'm signing on the bottom line that's saying that my IT infrastructure, it's secure, it meets regulatory standards, and a lot of times that comes with financial penalties. Depending on the severity and depending on the source of the regulation, it can even come with penal penalties like how do I stay out of jail? That's a big deal. The CXO really, really, really wants to stay out of jail, but he doesn't have the tools or skill set required to actually make that happen. He's entrusting that to you guys. You've got you guys, the IT pros, that are saying, you know what? I know I've got lots of data, but I don't know necessarily what that data is. I know I've got a lot of repositories. Hopefully you have a good feel for all the different file servers that are out there, but you don't necessarily know what data lives there. Is there a taxonomy on it? Do you have any classification today? Do you have any data management policies? So in other words, how do you control it? There's the content owner themselves. The content owner in this case, and it's probably worth defining these a little bit. The content owner is probably the least obvious one on here. And the content owner, think of this as the guy in the finance department that's kind of like the IT finance business champion. So he's sort of that liaison between the finance department and IT. He's one that helps explain the business needs of the finance department to IT so that you guys can build solutions to make the finance department run. And I keep picking on finance because when we move into the demos, that's the department that we're going to work with. So he basically is saying, you know what? Is my important data protected? I know the data. Like, I'm aware of the data that's on the server. So where you guys, the IT pros, may not necessarily know, what kind of data is out there, where that data lives, or what its purpose is, the content owner knows, but he doesn't necessarily understand the technology behind the scenes. He just entrusts that IT is making sure that data is secure, making sure that it's getting backed up, making sure that it's not duplicated. And then finally, you've got the information worker. And the information worker, this is an interesting beast. And I tried to sum up the IW in a single line, and it's kind of impossible. And you guys work with IWs with your end users every single day. And users are great. But at the end of the day, the end user's job is they have a job task, and it generally has nothing to do with IT. Their job is not to make sure that their documents are kept secure, that they're kept encrypted. Their job is not to ensure that they're adhering to IT policies. You want them to, and you can ask them to, but at the end of the day, they want to be empowered to do their job to the best of their abilities. So it's this continual fight where you've got CXO level pressure coming down. In other words, more secure, more controls, more audit, more this, more that, with no money, of course. And then you've got sort of pressure from the bottom up from the information workers, which is, hey, I just want to do my job. I want to do my job flexibly. I want to do my job the way that I'm most productive. With you guys as IT pros typically getting trapped in the middle. The way that we try to address this is how can we help the end users do their job? How can we keep the C-level executives happy and make them feel like they're secure, but give you guys the tools that you need to do this kind of work and keep everybody happy? And at the end of the day, what we're really trying to get to isn't just a place where the information worker is empowered to do their job the way that they want to, but they actually feel like IT's helping them. It's this whole concept of the IT hero, and that's something that you hear from Microsoft a lot, and you're going to hear from us more throughout the next year or two. So that kind of gives you an idea of the problem. Okay, so let's talk about how we're actually going to help you solve it. So data compliance, and this is getting right to what dynamic access control is all about. How can we first apply appropriate access policies? Today, when you guys build access policies, and when I'm talking about access policies for pretty much this entire presentation, I'm predominantly speaking about file servers. And I'm happy to talk about non-traditional file server specific locations in questions and at the end of this, because there is a difference. But I have these file servers, and my job is to manage access policy across those file servers. My guess is that for those of you today, when you manage access policy in your file servers, you're probably creating some sort of folder taxonomy on the file server that's related to job type or job function. So you'll have a finance share. And in that finance share, you might have like a power users folder. And you're going to build security to that folder structure. So basically what you're doing is you're applying and building a security policy, but you're building that based on the organizational structure that's defined through the file server folders. It's not the most logical thing to do, and what happens is data moves around, you're either doing one of two things. You're either violating security policy because files and folders are moving and taking and inheriting security policy that isn't ideal and not optimal, or what's happening is you're doing really, really, really random granular access policy changes on individual pieces of data as they move around. Either way, there's a burden of that. There's a high cost of that. Even if you can do that, how about auditing the access to the information? A lot of those business and regulatory standards we were talking about sort of imply this need to do audit. In other words, how do we know if somebody's accessing high business impact information? How do we know who they are, when they accessed it, and why they accessed? And that's a really, really difficult thing to do, as you guys probably know. Short of really, purpose-built audit solutions, which carry with them a pretty hefty price tag, this isn't something that's been very easy to do in the past. Encrypting information. So this is, how many of you guys, if anybody, use Active Directory rights management services in their environment? Or any kind of other data-specific encryption tool? Anybody? Nobody. A couple people, cool. Okay. So ADRMS plays into this as well. So I mentioned at the beginning, I'm the product manager for Active Directory, which includes RMS. And I talk to a lot of customers that use RMS. And those customers that don't use RMS, that want to use RMS, typically tell me that the biggest reason they don't is because the end users never remember to use it. They can have RMS, it can be deployed in the environment, but until the end users are smart enough or care enough to recognize that I have a piece of data that's super confidential and highly critical to my business, until the end user is smart enough to recognize, what, I need to apply rights management and encrypt that piece of data, it's kind of a failed deployment. So what we're really trying to do is how can we build the idea of information encryption into the classification of data itself? And then finally, how do we apply things like retention policies to information? How can we make smart decisions about what data we keep and what data we lose? Okay? So let's talk a little bit about the bones of dynamic access control. And this is a lot of the investments we've made within the Windows platform to sort of support this new concept of data management. So first of all, this is sort of the high level, and then I'll sort of dive into these a little bit. We've done we've brought what we call an existing claims model into the Windows platform. Does anybody here know what an identity claim is? Typically, identity nerds know what claims are. I don't expect, your typical IT pro that's never done something like deploying ADFS will never know what a claim is, and that's OK. But we'll talk about claims in a second. But we've brought this claims model into the Windows platform within Active Directory. This is a fairly huge change to Active Directory. This is probably the single biggest architectural change we've made to AD since Windows 2000. We've introduced a model now to target access and audit policies based on tagging. So we've introduced this method so that we can take metadata about the file and the documents themselves and apply access and audit policies based on that metadata. And the cool part is we're actually doing this within Active Directory. So we're not doing this localized on each file server. So I'm guessing there's some of you guys in the audience that may have hundreds of file servers spread out all over the world. This gives you guys a way to build a central access and audit policy stored within Active Directory, deployed via group policy that lets you manage access and audit information for all that data out there on all those distributed file servers. And basically what we're doing here is bridging the gap between IT and the information owners themselves, because the problem with data classification's been done. We've been able to do that for a while now. The difference is now that we're basically making it possible for the information owner to participate in the tagging process. We're giving them the ability to sort of self-classify their files, but more importantly, we're giving IT the tools they need to automatically classify those files based on policy, and we'll go through that. And then finally, this idea of building a solution to enable information governance on file servers. And this is a fairly holistic upgrade of the classification engine that we shipped in Windows 2008 R2. So first of all, we have to identify the information itself. So this is, if you guys have come to see me at the booth, we've talked about this a little bit. And this is, I promise everybody, we go into this in a little more detail. So basically, we've got all this information that's living out on the file servers. And we have 4 different ways in Windows Server 2012 that we can identify that information. We can identify it based on its location, which is more or less how it's done today. I know if I have a finance folder out on a particular file server, that every piece of data within that folder is automatically a finance classified document. There are good reasons for that. There are problems with that. No solution's perfect. But at the end of the day, that's an option we're giving you guys. There's manual classification. So we've extended the UI within Windows Explorer, both within Windows Server 2012, also within Windows Client, Windows 8 Client, and I'll show you that, so that users can self-classify their own files. So it's an additional tab within the Windows Explorer that they can actually do this classification. But I think the 2 most important and interesting are how we can do contextual identification. And contextual identification is something we're going to look at in the demo. And this is basically the ability for us to look at the contents of a document itself. In other words, read into a file. And based on the contents of that file, make smart decisions about classifying it. We're going to go through a demo and look at how I can automatically identify social security numbers and all my pieces of information out of my file servers and automatically classify that information as with a high level of personally identifiable information. I worked with the manufacturer who was doing like an early beta of this a while ago. And this is a particular manufacturer who we've all heard of. And basically, they've had some problems recently where they're electronics manufacturing. They keep developing products, and those products keep leaking because information keeps leaking from their organization. So I said, well, hey, what if we put a policy in place that said, you guys have a code name. They code name their products. And what if we made that product code name one of the contextual triggers within the file classification engine so that every time that word, that code name shows up in any document, anywhere on any of their file servers, it's automatically going to encrypt and lock down that file. I'm like, wow, we can actually do this. I'm like, yes, we can actually do that. And then finally, application classification. So out of the box, we have a really good ability to search and sort of classify and read into many different types of files on Windows Server. There are inevitably going to be files that, because they're not text-based or just have nothing to do with the Windows ecosystem, documents that we have no ability to read into and make decisions on. So we've actually got a really holistic API that partners and even customers can write into so they can actually use their own applications to automatically classify data. Going back to my example of a manufacturer, you could have a manufacturer with some sort of computer-aided design application. Maybe they use something like Pro-E. They could work with Pro-E and have Pro-E modified so that any work product coming out of Pro-E automatically gets classified as high business impact information because they're schematics or drawings. So that's sort of this openness. And this is a recurring theme. Everything we're going to talk about today, and I'll try to remember to keep pointing this out, is fully extensible. Everything we're doing here can be extended by partners and by our customers. So one example of how this workflow kind of works is basically as a user, and this is what we're going to look at in the demos too. As a user, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create or modify a file. And what happens is the file server is going to kick this over to this classification engine. And if anybody's familiar with the file classification infrastructure in Windows 2008 R2, think of this as like FCI on steroids. We've basically done some really, really important upgrades to FCI. Does anybody use FCI today, by any chance? OK, that's always the response I expect, by the way. So what we've done is some pretty significant upgrades to FCI, which I think makes it a really, really great tool. So what we're going to do is kick it over to FCI, and we're either going to use the inbox classification engine, or we're going to use a third-party classification plugin to basically determine how should that piece of data be classified. We save that classification back to the file metadata onto the file server, and then at that point, we've basically classified the file. What's interesting is when we talk about contextual and application-based, and actually even location-based classification as well, all this happens in near real time, and we're actually going to see this. We'd love to say real time. I don't think our lawyers let us say real time anymore, but it's near real time. It's somewhere between 1 and 10 seconds is typically what we see. So if anybody is familiar with the old FCI tool, FCI was basically running a schedule. At a certain time every day, it would go through and classify all the contents within its scope. In Windows Server 2012, we're actually doing what we call continuous classification. We're always looking at new files hitting the file system. As soon as that new file hits the file system, we run all the classification rules against it and are able to make changes. The other significant change is what we're calling resource claims in Active Directory. So for anybody who's really an AD, you'll realize this is like the world's most simplified version of a Kerberos ticket ever. So this is basically looking at a token that you would get when you log into your PC. I log in as a user, and I'm basically getting something like my user SID. I'm going to get a bunch of group SIDs as well. There's going to be some access policies in there. And you'll notice at the bottom, we've actually introduced this new thing. And these new things will actually sort of look at how you guys can actually see these claims as part of your login. We've introduced these new things called claims. Claims are basically derived from property values in Active Directory. Okay? I'm picturing this as part of a user. But we not only support user claims, we could also make claims against devices as well, computers. So what happens is when I log in, I have the ability in Active Directory to configure issuance of claims against certain properties. So I can pick out certain properties. In this case, I've picked out the department field and the country field, and this is what we're going to look at in the demo as well. And it's going to take the values that are set within Active Directory for my department and my country and issue those as part of my login. Once they're in my token, I can now make access decisions based against this. So typically, we've always been making access control decisions based on either individual users, which is really hard to manage at scale, or groups, which is typical and certainly manageable, but can tend to get hairy as you have really big group counts, lots and lots of nested groups. You also have the issue of group management. How do I know if groups are stale? How do I know if anybody's actually using the groups? So if we can use something like claims, it helps us make decisions based on this rich set of attribute information that many of you guys already have within Active Directory. And what's interesting is even though we're going to look at this from the file server perspective, the way that this is architected is technically any auth-z provider, so in this case a file server, it could be a customized application, anything that's basically doing authorization can look into these claims and make access control decisions based on these claims. You can actually see these with a command line if you just, I'm guessing most of you guys are familiar with whoami command. We've basically added a new flag to whoami called claims. So you can do whoami/claims and see all the claims information that's going to come out of your ticket when you log in. And we'll actually take a look at what that actually is when we do demos. So let's talk a little bit about the file server specifically, because this is where it's first surfaced within Windows Server 2012. So, file servers in the enterprise. They're great. They're scalable. They're super reliable. We can build massive file servers, and we can build very, very reliable and available file servers, especially in Windows Server 2012. Don't really have any sessions at MMS about it, but for anybody going to Tech Ed, we're doing a bunch of sessions on building basically super high availability file server solutions. Because I don't know if you guys have seen this, we can even use file servers now to host SQL databases and Hyper-V VMs. So we're building out file servers to really be this rock. You can build them. They can be huge. They can be super highly available, many, many nodes. Because there's no customized software on top, in other words, you buy Windows, you get file servers, they're also really, really cost effective. They're relatively cheap to run. There's not a lot of specialized skill set involved in doing that. And they're pretty secure and manageable simply because, again, they're using that Windows management model. Everybody here in this room, you're all IT pros, you guys understand that Windows management model. You understand how to keep Windows secure. These are all the really big benefits of running file servers. That's why we see so many of them out there. We can talk about SharePoint all day, and SharePoint's a great solution, but for many of you guys, file server is what you have because it's what you can afford, and that's because it's what you're comfortable with, and there's nothing wrong with that. They're typically one of the biggest repositories of data in the organization. This is where most of the data lives in your typical company. The problems, though, staying compliant to regulatory audits and participating in e-discovery for legal events is really expensive because there's no structured data management typically on a file server. It gets really expensive to do this kind of stuff. They're great for residual data access and being able to just get to the data when you need it. As far as getting to that data on using specific guidelines for purposes of things like e-discovery, it's really, really kind of difficult. Data leakage of sensitive information. We give you tools like Active Directory Rights Management Services to try to encrypt the information on the file servers itself. You can use tools like BitLocker to encrypt the data drives that the data is actually living on those file servers. But at the end of the day, these are solutions that are sort of bolt-on. They're after the fact. And typically, one of the more problematic parts of the file server is that data can easily leave file servers. And then finally, this ability, this exposure of information due to the complexity of granting access. We talked about this in the beginning where, file servers are built to secure things on a location basis. The problem is that locations work fine when you have one file server and a handful of departments. As you get into the place where you've got tons and tons of different departments and lots of different file servers all over the world, as you move data between those file servers, keeping the access policies set and configured across those file servers can be a real hassle. This is why we've built dynamic access controls, because we want to preserve the value of the file server, those things we have across the top, make it scalable, reliable, cost-effective, secure, and manageable, but try to solve some of those problems we have in the bottom. How can we help you guys do this easily and cost-effectively? So, at its core, dynamic access control implements what we call central access policies. This is sort of a logical representation of a central access policy. There's up to three different components. There's user claims, there's device claims, and there's file properties. You don't have to have user claims and device claims. You can have one or the other, but I thought it was worth showing both. The user claims and device claims both originate and get stored within Active Directory and are distributed as part of the login process. So as an example, I'm logging in as a user, and my user property called department has a value set to finance. My clearance level is set to high. I can also have device claims that show what department is my device a part of. So in other words, am I logging into a device that's trusted by a particular department? Is that device managed? Is that true? And then I can then couple that with file properties. And this is what we talked about with metadata set on the files themselves. So in the case here, what if I have a document? Is that document's department set to finance? What about its impact level? Is it a high business impact piece of information? I can set that value to high as well. And remember, we can make those decisions not just manually. We can make them based on the context of the data in that file itself. These get compiled together and basically composed into what we call a central access policy that gets stored and distributed via Active Directory. And basically what we're saying is, in the picture that you've got up there, is if you want to get access to finance information that has a high business impact, the user must be a finance department employee with a high security clearance and also be using a managed device registered to the finance department. So here what we've got is a fairly plain text description of a fairly complex access policy. The cool thing is here, I can store this in AD, push this out to all my file servers, and at the end of the day, I don't care where the information lives. It doesn't matter if it's on a file server 1 or file server 50. It doesn't matter if it's in the finance folder or if somebody accidentally copies it to a different folder, because again, I can look at tools to manage those data access policies centrally. It doesn't matter. We're taking location out of the equation. We do this in a language that we're kind of calling ACL++, and I can kind of show you what this looks like. But fundamentally, it's a really, really simple English language descriptor for building access policies. Is anybody here familiar with XACML? XACML? Anyway, all right, so anybody that is familiar with it knows that it's a fairly complex language. It's super powerful for doing sort of policy description. It's really, really powerful, and we tend to think that it's way too complex for your average user, which is why we've implemented this in what we call ACL++. I think I've got an example later in the slides of what it kind of looks like, but at the end of the day, it's very, very simple. We're talking about object, property, and value combinations coupled with operators, equals, does not equal, that kind of thing. And then we sort of take the central access policy, and then there's a workflow involved. So there's a few different components. So within Active Directory Domain Services, that's basically where I'm going to create those claim definitions. And again, pretty much everything I'm showing you in slides, I'm actually going to show you in the demo as well. So we're going to go ahead and create those claim definitions in Active Directory, because we don't want to send down every single attribute in Active Directory for a particular user object as part of the ticket. That would get really, really ugly. If you think you have token bloat now, it's definitely not going to help the problem. So what we're doing is selectively picking out claim definitions and pushing those claim definitions down based on what you guys want. Active Directory is also where you're going to create those file property definitions. So in the previous example, I talked about a piece of information having a high business impact. That high business impact property is actually created and stored in AD along with its value choices: high, medium, low, super, super high. We can store that in AD, and then again, via group policy, push that out to the file server. So again, do it once, and then push it out on demand to all those different file servers. There's no point in managing from lots of different places. And then finally, in AD is actually where we create that central access policy. So that central access policy, what we looked at earlier, again, it gets created in AD, and via group policy is going to get pushed out to all the different file servers. So I mentioned, GPOs are where the central access policies get pushed, and then on the file servers themselves, that's how you're actually going to apply the access policy to the shared folder. I can show you where that is. It's very, very simple. And then on the file servers themselves are responsible for identifying information. You can basically create the taxonomy and store the taxonomy within Active Directory. But at the end of the day, we're actually going to do that identification, that engine that I was talking about. That engine actually lives on the file server as part of the file classification infrastructure. And then finally, in the user's computer, all the user needs to do is access their information. And the reason I pictured this, even though there's no real task, is I want to make it really clear that depending on the way you configure it, your users have no need to become experts in anything. Your users are going to do their daily job. You guys are going to build a policy that embraces the way that those users do their job and automatically applies a security policy to it. Okay? We're introducing another new feature as part of dynamic access control, and this is really, really cool. We'll take a look at how this works for real. But as a workflow, we're introducing something called access denied remediation. So everybody in this room has tried to open up a file that they didn't have access to, and typically Windows is going to throw some really ugly, hairy error back at you that's saying, in the best of cases, it'll tell you you don't have access to the file. In other cases, it may say the file can't be found. Even though it is there, you just don't have access to it. So we tried to do a really good job within Windows Server 2012 is helping to fix that. How can we make it simpler for the users and your help desks to automatically try to remediate access denied issues? So here's an example of how this can work. I have a user that's going to attempt to open up a file on a file server. In this case, the user does not have access to that file. Okay? What's going to happen is the server is going to return an access denied error message because maybe in this case the user has not been assigned the appropriate claims. In other words, my example, maybe they tried to connect to a document that is allowed only to the finance department employees, but their finance department attribute in AD is not, or their department attribute in AD is not set to finance. And we'll look at the error message, but the error message they get back is actually descriptive. It's saying, you know what, there's something wrong. There's something wrong, you can't access this file. But if you really feel like you should have access to this file, click here for help. If anybody here is using SharePoint 2010, this is very similar to how SharePoint 2010 manages access denied, where you try to access a resource in SharePoint that you don't have access to, and you get that little message that basically says, you know what, you don't have access, but click here if you think you should have access. So we're not just going to say you don't have access. We're going to say, you know what, you don't have access, but let's try to help you fix it. The cool thing is that message is actually extremely configurable. It's centrally managed, distributed through group policy, but can be configured not just to give them a static click here for help. We can even give them links out to, you know what, click here if you want to try to self-remediate. And maybe it takes them to an e-learning site. And maybe that e-learning site requires them to go through some sort of video training on corporate policy before they get access to a certain class of information. Once that training completes, maybe that tool kicks off a note to, as an example, something like Forefront Identity Manager, say, you know what, this person is now a full-fledged member of the Finance Power Users group. Then Forefront Identity Manager can go into Active Directory, set that value. The user logs out, logs back in, gets the appropriate claim, and can now access their data. The cool thing is, all the user had to do is take the training that they were supposed to take in the beginning. The help desk never got called, and you guys don't incur extra cost. In this case, on a computer running Windows 8, and I'll try to be really specific as we go through this about what is required where. For access denied remediation, we do have a requirement for Windows 8 clients. Almost everything we talk about here today works with Windows 7 clients, works with down-level clients. This is one of the few examples. To do access denied remediation, we do require you to be running Windows 8 clients. But on a computer running Windows 8, what's going to happen is the Windows is going to retrieve the access information from the file server resource manager on the file server, which got the information from, centrally from group policy. And it's going to go ahead and present that message to the user with the access remediation options. It might be a link to request access. In the example we're going to look at, it actually gives the user the ability to write an email to the data owner. Now notice I said the data owner. It doesn't necessarily, in my example, it's not going to be a ticket back to the help desk. Because in a lot of cases, the help desk is not the best group to figure out who should have access to files. It should be the data owner, the guy that actually owns that finance data. In a lot of cases, should be the person making those decisions. So what we're doing is all about empowering the end users, helping the end users help themselves. Once the user satisfied the access requirements, maybe they have to sign a physical NDA, provide some other sort of assertion that they have a right to access that information. The user's claims can be updated, and then the user can access the file. So again, what I'm talking about is we're really trying to simplify the overall workflow and experience for the end user. We don't want to frustrate the end user. We want to honor and maintain IT compliance and security, but empower the end user to do their job. We've also got a new tool around auditing as well. So today, audit's really all or nothing. We can audit everything or we can audit nothing, and it's also not based in contextual information. However, in Windows 8, we're introducing the ability to do expression-based auditing. Remember I mentioned earlier that ACL++ thing? That's what we're talking about when I say expression-based auditing. This is basically gives the ability to do audit the resource attribute changes. So in other words, if somebody has a document and then all of a sudden that document is marked as high business impact, we can audit that. We can detect when that happens. We can also detect when that kind of data is accessed. So in the example I've got below, I've got user claims. So this is kind of very similar to the example I gave you guys earlier. I've got a user in the finance department whose clearance is high. I've got a file whose department is finance and the file impact is high. And I can write an audit policy out of that information. And again, these audit policies are built and stored within Active Directory and pushed out from there. And I told you I'd give you an example of what that ACL++ language looks like. It's incredibly straightforward. Basically what I'm saying is audit the success or failure if somebody tries to access a file whose department is finance or that file's impact equals high. If you have the opportunity, at the end, try to remind me, I'll give you guys some pointers to more information on dynamic access control. We've done 30 to 40-minute talks specifically on audit, but it's really powerful. You can even empower groups like your legal department who's trying to do e-discovery, empower them to use audit to basically figure out who's been accessing certain files based on the contents of those files. It's a really, really powerful tool. And this is probably one of my single favorite features. We've also implemented the ability to protect sensitive information. So I mentioned earlier, AD Rights Management Services. I love AD RMS. I think it's a great tool. I'm also very honest about the fact that I think it places an undue burden on the end user. At Microsoft, we have AD RMS deployed throughout the enterprise, obviously. We're all expected to use it. And I'll admit that I'm as bad as anybody. I will forget to apply information protection when I'm trying to write a document that should be protected. So we decided to do in Windows Server 2012 is, well, let's help make that easier. Let's help solve that problem by giving IT the ability to say, you know what? Based on the contents of a document, let's automatically encrypt it. Let's automatically apply a policy, and that's what we can do. So what we're going to do first is we can create a rule, and again, I'll demo this as well. We can create a rule that's going to basically automatically apply RMS protection to any file that contains the word confidential. Maybe that's the word that I want to trigger off of. I could trigger it off of a more specific word. I could say Contoso confidential. That rule is stored in the file server itself. I'm a user, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a Word document that's that's all about this new, highly confidential product we're going to be launching next year. It says, company confidential. I'm going to go ahead and save it. Now, note that I didn't have to actually do anything like in Word, like clicking on the File tab, clicking on Protect, applying an access policy. It's like 3 or 4 clicks to apply RMS protection within Microsoft Word. I don't have to do any of that. All I've done is done my job. I've created a document, and I've saved the document. Next thing that's going to happen is the file server is going to detect that it has a new document that matches criteria. In this case, matching that rule that I set that if it's confidential, go ahead and add RMS protection. It's going to go ahead and see that it says anytime I see the word confidential, set the HBI value to high. And anytime I see something with the HBI value set to high, automatically apply this particular RMS template to it. It's going to kick off a request to the RMS server, just like you would if I was an end user. And it's going to go ahead and apply the RMS protection to that file itself. That file is now secured and encrypted. And we'll actually look at this. It happens incredibly fast. In the demo that I'm doing, which is on a relatively slow machine, believe it or not, it actually happens within about 2 seconds. Okay? So this is incredibly powerful, where now you have the ability to encrypt documentation, encrypt sensitive documents without the end users having to do anything. So to sort of sum this up, dynamic access control and file servers, it's basically 4 key areas. It's all about classifications. In other words, you can inherit classification tags from the parent folder, and we'll look at that. I can have a folder that's marked as finance, and if I have a folder that's marked as finance, everything within it is going to get classified and marked as a finance document. I can do manual tagging based on the owner. So in other words, I can say that for a particular file share, I can say this person has the rights to go in and make classification changes. Again, it's kind of manual. I can do automatic tagging. This is what we talked about earlier, where I can tag based on the context within those documents. We'll look at how we can do the tagging. We can do it not only based on strings like confidential, we can also do it based on regular expressions, which is what we're going to look at in the demo, where I can basically do regular expression searches for pattern matches. So I can look at a 3-2-4 pattern for social security numbers, and anytime I see that, I can create a rule based around that format. And then, like I mentioned, this is fully extensible. Partners, you guys, anybody can basically go out and build an application that is able to self-classify its own information, so that any information coming out of a particular piece of software automatically gets classified as X. Okay? Access control. So this idea of central access policy is based on classification. I no longer need to manage individual access control lists on every single folder, every single share on all of my file servers geo-distributed all over the world. I'm going to create a relatively simple NTFS security policy, and then I'm going to use central access policies to enhance that and make that more specific. But the advantage is that I'm doing it centrally and deploying it globally. We mentioned access denied remediation, which I think is huge, and we'll take a look at how that looks. I think this is going to be really, really powerful, especially as organizations are rolling out Windows 8. I think this is going to become one of those things where the users are just going to expect the ability to self-remediate their own problems. I'm sure you guys have heard, as part of MMS, we've talked a lot about private cloud and self-service. It's all about empowering people. If we can empower people, it brings costs down and raises user happiness. This is one of those examples where we can do that. We talked about audit, how we can build these central audit policies and basically stage them and then roll them out centrally. It's expression-based, that language we talked about. I urge everybody to take a look at it. It's incredibly simple. It's one of those things like it's basically you write how you think, which is a really important thing. We also have the ability to basically, and I didn't really talk about this, we have the ability to stage audits. So I can build an access policy and then deploy that access policy in a staged or a simulated mode. So in this case, I can have an access policy built, and before I roll it out, again, remember all these access policies are central, I can have that access policy, and when I roll it out, I can roll that access policy out in a simulated mode. So before I actually impact my end users, before I potentially accidentally cut off access to all these important documents, I can basically simulate how that would look through the use of audit tools. And then finally, the ability to do automatic RMS protection. So we can automatically RMS protect Microsoft Office documents. We can extend that automatic RMS protection to third-party file types using partner-based tools. And it's near real-time protection. That's really, really important. We've had the ability to do some of this stuff for a version now, but we've never had the ability to do near real-time classification. All right. So that's everybody's sort of 101 introduction to dynamic access control, and I kind of promised we'd spend most of the time here this morning doing demos. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to step into the demo environment, and I'm basically going to walk through a bunch of scenarios. Sound good? Any questions before we get into the demo? Yeah.
What about support for smaller languages, versions that don't have a corresponding server OS language? So language packs, basically.
I don't think you did the ability. So the question was, what about support for languages that don't have localized versions of Windows attached to them? I'd have to double check, but I don't believe we support classification for non-localized versions of Windows. That's a great piece of feedback, though. Grab me afterwards, because I'm really curious to talk more about that. That's something we talked about the other day. So that's a great question, though. Anybody else? Cool. OK. Demo. So I want to give you guys a quick snapshot of the demo environment, because we're going to spend a lot of time. I want to kind of talk about who's involved. So there's a cast of characters. There's an IT administrator. And in this case, I'm violating best practices, and my IT administrator is called administrator. This is the guy that's responsible, guy or girl, that's responsible for configuring claims, configuring the central access rules, central access policies, et cetera. This is basically the experience of the person that's going to be logged into the domain controller using Active Directory Administrative Center. I've got a content owner. In this case, his name is Jason. Jason is the guy that manages the data shares for the finance departments. In other words, he's a finance department employee, but he's that power user. He's that guy that works really closely with IT to make sure that finance is able to honor IT policies and support finance's business needs, but at the same time, he understands the finance business model. He understands what their needs are. And then we have a couple of information workers. We've got Ashley. Ashley's a brand new employee. She just joined our company. She got hired in the finance department, but she hasn't gone through training yet. So she's going to sit down on her very first day. She's going to go ahead and access her data share, and we're going to see what that experience looks like. And And then finally, we have Ben. Ben's been in the finance department for quite some time now. So he's used to creating information on the finance file server, file shares. And at the end of the day, he just wants to do his job. He doesn't want to be responsible for implementing IT policy. He just wants to do his job. The topology we're going to talk about, and for anybody that saw my direct access thing yesterday, it's like the opposite of that. It's a super, super simple topology. And the reason I'm pointing this out is you guys can go home tomorrow when you guys go home, you guys can actually build this exact scenario. It's really, really simple to do, and most of the documentation's online. We really only have three pieces of infrastructure in place. We've got a client, we've got a domain controller, and we have a file server. Technically, there's an Exchange server, but that's kind of miscellaneous. I'm just using that for fun. OK? All right. So we're going to flip over. There we go. This is my domain controller. So I don't know how many of you guys have gotten a chance to play around with Windows Server 2012. This is the Windows Server 2012 Active Directory Administrative Center. Did anybody play with ADAC in 2008 R2? OK. For some reason, nobody knew it existed, which I think is a shame. It was actually a pretty good tool. We've done a ton of work in it for Windows Server 2012, though. I'm going to take a quick departure and just sort of mention a couple of things. So within the Administrative Center, the goal was to remove the need for a lot of the individual Active Directory management tools that are out there. The other goal was to basically plumb this fully on top of PowerShell. So you've probably noticed, and if you've talked to any of the guys in the PowerShell booth over in the Expo Hall, we've done a ton of work in Windows Server 2012 around PowerShell. Everything I'm going to show you today that I'm going to do through the GUI, you guys can do through PowerShell. In a lot of cases, and the ADAC is a great example, it's because we actually built the GUI on top of PowerShell. So when you're working in the GUI, you're actually executing PowerShell commandlets behind the scenes. And even though this isn't directly related to dynamic access control, I think it's worth showing, we've also implemented this ability to actually record what you're doing. So we've got this thing called the history viewer. So if you're interested in PowerShell, not very familiar with it, but would love to learn, I've talked to a couple people at the show that are, as an example, doing a lot of ADSI editing within Active Directory. If you're interested in transitioning your skill set and learning more about PowerShell, this is a great way to learn, because if I go ahead and I create a new user within Active Directory, I'm going to automatically get the output of what that was in PowerShell. The same thing's true for everything we're going to do within dynamic access control. When I create those central access rules, when I create those claims, I'll have the ability to see how that looks in PowerShell. So something to take a look at when you get the opportunity to go download the beta. This is a really, really nice feature. For now, I'm going to go ahead and shrink this because I need the screen real estate. And we're going to go ahead and move down to the section on dynamic access control. So you'll notice up at the top of ADAC, we've got the typical naming context stuff. The different OUs, this is a very, very simple environment, so I don't have a lot of OU structure. But we're going to go ahead and move down to this dynamic access control section. So we've got a few different things that I wanted to point out here. I mentioned this idea of claims. So within claims, we can build claims that are based on and mapped to the different attributes within Active Directory. The problem is Active Directory has a ton of attributes, especially if you guys have done schema extensions to things like Exchange or other products. It can get kind of overwhelming. We don't want to send down all those attributes in the form of claims during the login process. So what we do instead is we give you guys, as the administrator, the ability to identify what claims, what attributes are important to you as you define that security policy. In this case, for my example, I've basically defined department and country, and we're really going to work on department today. And it's a really, really simple thing. Let this come up. I mentioned my demo environment's a little slow. Here you go. So basically, what we've done is I've selected the department value, which is just department display name, gets mapped to a claim called department, and that's really all I have to do for it. I can create values if I want to, but for the most part, I'm just going to leave that blank. So creating the claim is about a 2-second process. You guys just have to sort of decide what values are important to you. Right along with this, we've got these things called resource properties. Resource properties are how we describe the data that lives out in our file servers. In this case, I don't know how well it's rendering. If you look, those top 3 items, PII_MS, impact_MS, and department_MS, are a little bit darker than the stuff below it. It's because those are the 3 that are enabled. We give you a ton of resource properties out of the box that Microsoft thinks are likely going to be good for you guys to use. In this case, though, what I've done is I've picked 3, and I've gone and enabled 3. I've enabled PII, which is for personally identifiable information, impact, and department. And if you look, and we're going to go ahead and open up PII, not only can we define those resource properties, I can define the values of those resource properties. So out of the box, we're going to give you certain values, and of course, you guys have the ability to edit those, remove them, add to them as you see fit. One of the most popular questions I get, and I'm going to go ahead and answer it now before I'm asked, is how can you guys help me build this taxonomy? Lots of people have lots of data on file servers. We talked about that earlier, but defining a taxonomy for data that's already in place is really hard. The great news is right around the same time, sort of as we launch Windows Server 2012, we're going to be making a tool available through Microsoft Solution Accelerator team that is purpose-built to help you guys do this. It's basically an information classification toolkit. It's a free download that you guys can download and install. For anybody that's going to be going to TechEd US, I think, I don't know if we're doing the European show, there's going to be a TechEd session specifically around using that Solution Accelerator tool to basically help manage data classification. We're also going to have the Solution Accelerator guys in the expo halls for both TechEds, and they'll be able to demo this. And I'll be able to demo it at TechEd as well. So keep an eye out for that. That's a question I always get because we understand this is kind of a daunting process. We don't want to make you think we don't. So now that I've got my claims configured, I've got my resource properties configured, I need to combine those together and actually create those central access rules. Central access rules get combined together to build central access policies. In my world, because it's a very, very small demo environment, it's very, very simple. I have a single rule that's a member of a single policy. And what I've done is I've created this finance department policy. And it's really, really straightforward. Basically, I have to name it. That's really simple. I have to define a scope. And remember, we said dynamic access control and central access policy is all about removing locality from the equation. We don't want to make your file security infrastructure dependent on the physical folder structure of your file servers. So in this case, we're using that document metadata. We're saying any resource whose department property is set to finance, this is what this rule applies to. And then below that, we have to apply permission sets. So we've got a permission set. And remember I mentioned earlier that we can both do current permissions and we can also propose permissions. We can almost synthesize and then basically simulate what a deployment of a particular security policy is going to look like. This is where you would do it. So within proposed permissions, I could create a simulated security policy and see how that's going to affect my end users through exposure to the audit. Okay? But for today, we're going to look at the current permission set. You'll notice this is an incredibly simple security policy. Basically what I'm saying is all authenticated users get full control, which seems crazy, right? But instead what I'm actually doing is I'm applying a condition to it. All authenticated users get full control, but only if their user department equals finance. So now I'm no longer dependent on the finance group within Active Directory having a current up-to-date membership. What I'm dependent on is making sure that the user department attribute within Active Directory is set to finance. And especially if you're using some sort of a feed from your HR management system into Active Directory, this is a really, really simple process because the HR system knows what department you're in, which makes it really easy for Active Directory to know what department you're in. A lot of companies are using products like Forefront Identity Manager is one example to sort of flow that information from HR in Active Directory. This is a great way to use that. So now I've got my claims, I've got my resource properties, and I've got my central access policy and rules set up. Cool thing is this is pretty much all I need to do with an AD. This is again, it's a fairly simple example, but it's a really, really simple thing to get set up. So as an administrator, you're more or less done. You've created your policy, you've created your claims, you've created your resource properties, and your job is fundamentally done. You can now offload the day-to-day work of this down to the file owners themselves, down to the data owners. So we're going to go ahead and step off of the domain controller, and we're actually going to move on to the file server to sort of look at the next stage of this. So a couple of things I want to point out. Actually, no, I'm going to do a different one first. We are going to look at the client experience of access denied remediation. So remember back to my example, we had Ashley, who was the brand new employee, not a member of the finance group, but she was hired into it. Or not a member of the finance attribute, but yeah. So I'm here, I'm logged into a client, and I'm going to go ahead and log into this client as Ashley. So it's her first day. She gets her brand new Windows 8 PC. She sits down and she wants to go ahead and browse to her file share to sort of, because one of her coworkers said, you know what, you should take a look at this file share. It's where we keep all of our information. It would really probably help you, get your day started by going there. So she's going to go ahead and open up a file share. And in this case, she's going to browse to file1-beta, which is my file server, whack finance, which is the share that she's been told she needs to go to. So she says, OK, let's go to finance. Oh, there's a problem. But I want you to notice a couple of things. We're not telling her file can't be found. We're not giving her ugly, you don't have rights to this. We're saying, you know what, there's a problem, but let's help you solve it. So you'll notice there's a problem accessing file 1 beta finance, and then it says, attention, you do not currently have access to this file. Please use the link below to request access. I typed that. I created that within my domain group policy and then pushed that out. I'm also giving her the ability to request assistance. In this case, in the example I'm using, remember I mentioned that we were just going to do an email transmission. I don't have a fancy identity management solution set up. If anybody comes back to TechEd, I will have a fancy identity management solution set up, and we're going to look at this differently. But for today, I'm just going to give her the option to explain. So you know what? I'm a new user to the finance department, just started today. Please grant me access. And she can go ahead and say, OK, send the message. It's going to go ahead and send that message. There's no dependency on the client having Exchange, having Outlook, having anything set up. This is all handled behind the scenes. So it's going to go ahead and send this message. While that's sending, we're going to go ahead and we're going to log back. Actually, make sure it's sent. All right, successfully sent. So now what we're going to do, we're going to log in. Again, I'm using the same machine. We're going to log in as Jason. Remember I mentioned in our earlier example, Jason is my data owner. He's that guy in finance that IT has sort of entrusted to be their liaison. So they've entrusted him with a slightly greater amount of power because they want to offload some of those day-to-day tasks from the help desk. Because at the end of the day, the help desk may be an expert on access policy, but what they're not an expert on is how finance uses their own information. So Jason's going to log into his desktop, and he's sitting here, and he's going to open up Outlook, which I've already got open. And Jason just got a new mail. So Jason got a mail coming from the file server, and it's basically saying, don't reply, but you just had a user request access to a shared file or folder, and they couldn't get into it. And then it's going to, what? User Ashley tried to get to this folder and this particular share, and it's going to give the justification that she gave, which is, I'm going to use it to the finance department, just started today, but I need access. Wow. So how do we solve that? And this is, how many of you guys actually work on a help desk? Anybody? OK, but you all work with help desks, presumably. So the help desks you work with, I'm sure they can tell you lots of really great war stories about getting phone calls from end users saying, I can't get to X. And that's pretty much all the information they give. And it's in a way, it's almost unfair to ask the end users to have a really good understanding of how those access policies are displayed. Because again, the end users just want to do their job. So what we're trying to do is help provide some of that information for them. So in this case, we're basically going to give that person a display of what the issue is. You know what? She can't get full control. She can't modify that information. She can't read it. She can't write it because that is blocked. And notice effective access, because we're going to look at what effective access is in just a few minutes. And the reason that access is limited is because of this finance department access policy. And if anybody remembers, we were on the Active Directory domain controller. That domain controller and my policy that I created was called the finance department access. Again, because we're limiting that policy centrally, we're making it a lot simpler to troubleshoot this stuff. Because we're going to give Jason, in this case, who's the data owner, the tools he needs to say, you know what? She's blocked by the finance department. So what we're going to do next is actually hop over to the finance server, and I'm going to show you something new called effective access. So on the file server, we're going to go ahead and open up that share. I keep it on the data drive. There's this finance folder. I'm going to go to properties. Oops. I'm on the security tab. I'm going to click advanced. You'll notice there's a new tab up here. Actually, there's a couple new tabs up here. We've got this thing called effective access. We have this thing called central policy. So let's look at central policy for a second. So central policy is basically how I take that central access policy that I created in Active Directory and then apply that to a file server. This is where this happens. So I've deployed it through group policy, and this is where it gets applied. I've also got this tab called effective access. This is really cool. So how many of you guys are familiar with how we do like result instead of policy for group policy, where you can take lots of policies? So we recognize going into this that as you've got local NTFS permissions and theoretically multiple access policies all sort of affecting a particular resource all at the same time, we need to give you guys tools and the data owners tools to figure out why doesn't a person have access to it. So this is what we're calling effective access, where we basically take and do a reverse evaluation of a user or a service principal's ability to access information. So we can actually simulate this. So I'm going to go ahead and select the user. In this case, I'm going to simulate Ashley. Remember I mentioned device claims. If I wanted to, I could actually simulate what device she's authenticating from. And basically what this is going to do is download the contents of what her access should be and then compare that against what's required of the resource. In this case, I'm not going to ask about a specific device, but I'm going to say, you know what, what's her effective access to the finance department? Oh, wow, she doesn't have any access at all. So I can scroll down and wow, yeah. So it pretty much matches, this is kind of the expanded view of what was in that email. So I can say, well, you know what, she needs access, but I need to make sure that I add the right thing. So let's look at claims. What if I make her department equal HR? She still doesn't have access. Well, it's finance data, so what if I make it finance? And all of a sudden she has access. So basically it gives us the ability that based on those attributes in Active Directory, as they change, how does that change a person or a service principal's ability to access that information? Does this all make sense to everybody? Does this seem like at least like relatively useful in your worlds? Hopefully it's nodding heads. All right, cool. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is sort of look at the other side of the coin. We're going to take a look at that data management on the file servers themselves. So we're going to stay on the file server, and we're actually going to open up the File Server Resource Manager. How many of you guys have ever used the File Server Resource Manager? All right. everybody should check out the File Server Resource Manager, especially in Windows Server 2012. We've done a ton of updates to it. It is an incredibly useful data management tool. All right, so within the File Server Resource Manager, we're going to take a look at a couple different things. We're going to look at that automatic classification that I talked about, and we're going to take a look at, once we've classified it, what are some interesting things we can do with it, and then I'm going to show you the user experience of it. So first of all, I want to point this out. We have these classification properties. These classification properties, you'll notice that they look two different ways. We've got folder owners and folder usage. They look, it's probably kind of hard for you guys to see, but it's basically a document with like a little dialog box in front of it, and then we've got these other ones that have a little globe and a lock on it. That's because those three, and if you remember back to the Active Directory view, those are the three different resource properties that we created in Active Directory and then pushed out to the file servers. So again, these are centrally managed, centrally administered, and pushed out. But we have access to them on the local file servers. We can use those to then go ahead and create rules. I've got a very simple rule created, which is to identify high value personally identifiable information. So first of all, we're going to give it a name, and then we have to pick a scope. In other words, where does this affect data? So I've basically picked my data drives, my C data drive and my E data drive. I can also automatically classify scope based on type. So you can classify what types of folders make up group data, what types of folders make up user data, and affect it that way as well. Finally, I need to go ahead and set a classification policy. So first, I need to decide what type of content am I going to classify, or how am I going to classify the information. So I can classify it based on content, which is what we talked about with the contextual search. I can classify it based on the folder that it lives in, or I can also classify it using PowerShell. Today, what we're going to do is actually classify it using content. The next thing I have to do is configure the parameters. So how am I going to classify it? Like I said, I could pick a string. I could pick Contoso confidential, and that certainly works. What I wanted to show, because I think it's a little more interesting, is dynamic data. So say we want to automatically identify all personally identifiable information, and the way that our organization has defined that is anything with a social security number. And of course, organizations are going to have lots more than that. What I can do is basically put in a regular expression that is basically evaluates out to the format of a social security number. And for anybody who's a regex nerd like me, you'll note that this is a really horrible regular expression string for a social security number. This is for demonstration purposes only. This doesn't validate valid social security numbers versus invalid. Basically, what we're doing here today is validating 3-2-4. But you can put in very, very complex regular expressions in this field, and we'll go ahead and evaluate them. Okay? So we went ahead and said, OK, we want to do content classification. The parameter we want to use is a regular expression that matches the social security number. And then we're going to say OK. And then what we want to do is, what do we do with that? So if we have a piece of information whose context evaluates to that string or that regular expression, what do we do with it? In that case, what we're going to do is set this personally identifiable information property. Remember, there's only 3, because this is what I pushed down. We're going to go ahead and set that to high. And remember, I mentioned not only those properties, but those values as well are coming from Active Directory. Active Directory is this fantastic tool. I'm guessing, maybe with the exception of 1 or maybe 2 of you, everybody in this room is using Active Directory in their organization. However, we think that there's a lot more that people can do with Active Directory. It's this fantastic asset that you've got. So what we're really trying to do is push more and more value into Active Directory. So now that we've got all this configured, what are we going to do with it? Well, now I can also create a file management task. So in this case, I've configured a file management task to actually do automatic rights protection. So I've got a rights protection rule that basically says, again, I'm going to pick a scope, and I'm going to pick a condition. In this case, if the personally identifiable information property is set to high, pick an action. In this case, I'm automatically applying RMS encryption. I think a couple hands went up when I asked if anybody had used the File Server Resource Manager. The older versions of FSRM actually, in a really roundabout way, had the ability to automatically apply RMS protection, but it was through the bulk protection tool, which is less than awesome. We now natively integrate with rights management services. We'll just pull down the templates from the RMS server and apply them. I can not only do specific templates, I can even do manual policies. And this is kind of what I have here. You'll notice this is an incredibly open policy. Basically, all I'm saying is anybody can get to it. I just want it encrypted. I would obviously not encourage this. I would encourage very well-restricted policies. I can also pick a schedule. And you'll notice that I still have this schedule option up here, but we have this new option down here where it's called continuous operation. And this is what I talked about. This is a really, really significant enhancement to FSRM, where now we not only classify on a scheduled basis, but we also classify in real time. As soon as the file hits the file system, we classify and run rules on it. OK? All right, so let's take a look at how this actually looks to the end user. So we're going to jump back to my client. And we're going to log out as Jason. We're going to log in as Ben. Because remember, Ben's my tried and true finance employee. He's the guy that's been there for a while. He just wants to do his job. OK. So we're going to move over to the desktop. On his desktop, he's got this finance share. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so he's got this finance share. And he just heard about this new employee. Ashley just joined the finance group, and he needs to create an employee record within the finance share for Ashley. So he's going to go ahead and do that. So let's do new. Actually, we're going to do two things. We're going to create a text document first that says finance numbers, not especially sensitive information. But what I want to show you is the classification. So he can look at the properties of that piece of information, or Jason can, or an IT administrator can. And you'll notice that there's this classification tab. This is also new. For anybody that downloads this and plays with this on their own, the classification tab on the client is not automatically exposed in the beta. I think it's going to be exposed later, but for now it's not. But there's a group policy setting. You can actually make the classification tab show up on the client. It always shows up on the server, but it only selectively shows up on the client. But if you click on this classification tab, I want to point out two things. First of all, you'll notice the department's automatically set to finance. I didn't do that. The reason that happened is, remember, one of those things that I mentioned is one of the ways we can classify files is by location. What I've said is anything within that finance folder, automatically it's classified as finance data. So I've done that. You'll notice that the impact is none and the personally identifiable information value is none as well. I certainly have the ability to change that. I could say, you know what, nope, this is a high impact file, and save it. So it saves it. But what I really want to do is show you the automatic classification. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a Word doc. And I'm going to say Ashley new employee record. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. So here I am. Word's going to complain about the fact that I haven't registered. Sorry. I'm going to go ahead and say Ashley's new record. And I'm going to go ahead and type social security number. Obviously not Ashley's real social security number. And I'm going to save it, and I'm going to come back and finish the rest later. So I go ahead and I'm going to click Save. Go ahead and click Close. Notice it's 13K, so it's a very, very small file. I'm going to just refresh this real quick, and it just bumped up to 131K. The reason that happened is it's automatically RMS encrypted. So I want to show you two things now. I want to go back into the properties of this file, onto the classification tab, and look at two things. So you'll notice that the department's still set to finance because we're still in the location classification. But now that personally identifiable information field is also set to high, because if you remember, I had that regex string that was looking for social security numbers. It found a match, and what it was set to do is if I find a match, automatically set that PII value to high. But then you remember, we also had that file management rule that basically looked for any document whose PII value is set to high and add RMS encryption. And I can actually show you that too. So now, remember, I haven't actually had to set any RMS encryption. Once you've actually set the RMS policy, consuming RMS content is really easy. You don't really have to do anything. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. The first time it happens, I'm going to get prompted to say, oh, you know what? It's currently restricted. I need to contact your RMS server. In my environment, my RMS server is actually my file server. I'm going to go ahead and say, OK. It's going to ask me to authenticate again. And I think I'm Ben. It's going to go ahead and download the use certificate. And here I am. I'm back in Word. And you'll notice the only thing that's changed, you think I would just register this. The only thing that's changed is now I've got that yellow banner across the top that says, you know what? You can read the message, but I can't forward, print, or copy content because I've restricted it. So again, as a user, I haven't had to do anything. That's really, really important. I did my job. I created that employee record. But IT and the file owners have helped me do my job and keep my data secure by automatically creating policy that's going to take effect on that data itself. Make sense? Yeah. Will it reclassify? It will not. That's a really good question. No, so basically, once those file properties get set, they can be manually removed, or you could create a job to remove them, but they don't automatically get removed. That's a really good question, though. Very good question. The other thing that's worth pointing out is we do not classify or do contextual search of encrypted information. So we can't, obviously. Like, it's just not possible. So even if we could pull that value back off, we couldn't detect that value as there, because to us, this now looks like an encrypted blob. OK? It can't be scanned again. We'll scan it, and we can look for things like file name, and we can look at the metadata that's already there, and we can assign new classification. But we can't do contextual classification if it's already encrypted, because the encryption process, like the RMS, basically the process of checking out and opening up an RMS encrypted doc isn't part of the content classifier. So that was the demo. That's a pretty quick overview of dynamic access control. If you guys found this even like tangentially interesting and would like to learn more about it, I would highly encourage it. A few other Windows Server sessions are up on the screen. I'd plug them because we don't do a ton of Windows Server stuff at MMS, but I'm on the Windows Server team, and it's a lot of fun. The other thing I'll throw out there is if this is interesting, if you go to, and I'll sort of walk this through, and I think this is being recorded, so you guys can play this later if I forget, or if you forget. If you go to TechNet and then click on Library, then click on Windows Server, then Windows, I think it still says Windows Server 8 Beta. I don't think we changed the name. There are all these scenarios, and one of the scenarios that you guys can actually click on to learn more about is dynamic access control. Part of those scenarios are lab guides that actually walk you through building out a lab very similar to mine. It's a little bit different. I don't know that the email part's there, but like the access denied remediation, I can't remember if that's there. But there's also, we didn't have time, but it also goes to an example of how audit works. So if you guys are all interested in this, I would encourage you to download the beta bits and go play with this stuff. All the documentation and lab guides are on TechNet. There's also a hands-on lab all about dynamic access control that you guys can run through if you haven't already. So that's what I got. I'm here for questions. Does anybody have any? All right. We're free to go. Oh, yeah, sorry. That's not true. So if you update it, we actually do reclassify modified files. We detect new and modified files as long as the modified file is scannable. So in other words, if it's a file type we can't read, we obviously can't do it, which would include encrypted files. But if I have a Word doc that says Josh, I save that Word doc. It's not going to classify, obviously. But then if I go back into that doc and actually type Social Security number and hit save, it'll go back through and detect that because I changed that document. So we do detect modification on the file server. If you take it back out, we don't reclassify. We don't remove attributes. We don't remove attributes based on lack of data. Yeah, because remember that PII value can be manually set. So we can't remove a value. I'd have to look at if we could write a rule. You could do it using PowerShell. So we support that PowerShell classifier. So yeah, but not really. Yeah. Yeah. Does RMS? Yeah. So the whole point of RMS is basically there's two real things in RMS, right? We encrypt the file, and the other part of RMS is we apply policy to that file. In my example, my policy was everyone gets access to the file. So if I email that file, remember Ashley in my example? If I email that file to Ashley after she has access rights to that finance share, she'll be able to open it up. She'll still see that it's access restricted, but she'll be able to open up that file and make changes to it. Even if I have a more granular policy, like I can set it to like a lot of companies, including Microsoft, we have access policies that are set to FTE only, so full-time employees only. So if I send an RMS encrypted document out accidentally over email, I can actually restrict that so that only full-time employees can actually read it. So absolutely, RMS is built to basically facilitate information sharing via policy. That's actually a really important distinction to something like RMS encryption versus other types of encryption. Yeah?
What happens if they take a copy that they had offsite somewhere, make a bunch of changes, and you've got a tag, it's encrypted and all that, and they go along and go, bam, and they overwrite a copy of this.
So let me make sure I get this. So you've got a file. You take that file offsite, and you make edits to it. You bring that file back on site, and you save it back in the file share. We see that as a new object, and we'll go ahead and do classification on it. Yeah. Any other? Yeah.
Is there any mechanism for auditing who has access to a file or file share using, for example, we have a requirement that yearly we have to have the content owners review access to all their data.
Mm-hmm.
That's
exactly what the audit process of this is built to do. So basically what you could say is, I want to write an audit policy that shows every access of a document tagged with finance. That's exactly what the audit policy is for. And it would show them who accessed it, when they accessed it, and record it in the audit log. It's going to give you depending, it could give you a mountain of data, but it's there. The option's there. If you're looking at that much data, we're doing a lot of work with partners on so we sort of provide and facilitate the audit engine. But if you've got that much data, there may be better ways to view it than within our own audit viewer, like our own audit logs. So we're doing a lot of work with partners to sort of help organize, archive, and view that information in a useful manner. But yeah, the engine's there, completely there in this. That's what it's for. Yeah, no, it's huge. I mean, it's an incredibly efficient engine for what it's worth. It's incredibly efficient. I think what you'd want to do, though, is do the audit and then sort of archive that somewhere, because you're not going to want to, at one point, just look. I mean, the audit policy needs to be in place before the data is accessed. So you put the audit policy in place, and then as access to that policy happens, or access to that data happens, the policy is going to hit and record that in the audit. So you're going to want some sort of tool in place to then remove that information and then data warehouse it somewhere. Because if your policy, if your IT policy is once a year evaluate that, that's going to be a mountain of information.
It's not even who access, it's who could access.
Yeah, so that's actually pretty easy to do as well. Like you could very easily, using central access policies, have a single screen view of who has access to your information. That's actually really easy to do. Anybody else? Anybody else? I'll stick around for a few minutes if people want to grab me afterwards. Otherwise, I'll be in the booth. So, thanks.